So, good evening to you all. My name is Christoph Paulus and I'm a senior researcher here at the Astor Institute on International Humanitarian Law and International Criminal Law. And I'm also a research fellow at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism here in The Hague, the ICCT. I would like to welcome everybody to another lecture in the context of HILAC, which stands for the Hague Initiative for Law and Armed Conflict. And this is a lecture series on IHL that has been organized since 2005 by the Astor Institute in cooperation with the Netherlands Red Cross and also the Amsterdam Center for International Law. And tonight is a special HILAC lecture since it's organized also in cooperation with the ICCT, I already mentioned it, which is an independent think and do tank providing multidisciplinary policy advice and practical solution-oriented implementation support on prevention and the rule of law, which are two vital pillars of effective counterterrorism. Now, we're very proud to have with us tonight Dr. Lyal Sunga. Dr. Sunga is the head of the Rule of Law program at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, and he's also a visiting professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. And he's conducted monitoring, investigation, reporting, technical cooperation, training, and teaching in some 55 countries over the last 25 years in human rights, humanitarian law, and international criminal law. And tonight, Dr. Sunga will speak about international law, including IHL, but also other subfields such as international criminal law and whether it can meet the challenges of today's lawless conflicts. So, Dr. Sunga, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Well, it's a real pleasure to have been invited and to speak here tonight on a topic which I think is an important one, and especially coming to the Astor Institute, which has such a long history and so famous for the substance and its research and its training in international humanitarian law and in other related fields. So it's a real pleasure for me to come here and address you tonight. Well, today the topic that we'll be discussing is, can international law meet the challenges of today's lawless conflicts, rather loosely speaking. And I'll explain what I mean as we go. And hopefully we'll have ample time as well for questions and answers and to kick around some of the ideas that, some of the issues I'll be raising. So let me just make sure this thing works. There we go. Well, the title is the same title of an article that I used, that I published in the Guardian newspaper the day after the Paris attacks, and that article stirred up some debate and got some attention. I didn't really expect it. It somehow resonated a bit, and it argued that today's lawless conflicts involve terrorism that is itself much more dangerous than in past times. And that these kind of conflicts are not adequately addressed by the fields of domestic criminal law and transnational criminal law, even where you have cooperation among states. It's still very difficult to deal with this issue. And international criminal law and the laws of war, the international humanitarian law, is also finding itself rather limited in terms of adapting to new circumstances. So it discusses some possible ways to meet better the challenges of today's lawless conflicts. So this evening, what I'd like to do is develop the argument, more fully than what I could do in a newspaper editorial. First, by lawless conflicts. I don't mean that law doesn't apply to certain conflicts, but that certain parties have been behaving as if it doesn't. So, first point. Second, by conflict, of course, I'm really talking about armed conflict and not other types of conflict, social conflict or religious conflict, although obviously these kind of conflicts can be intertwined or reinforcing cleavages in society, etc., and can lead to armed conflict. What I have in mind in terms of lawless conflicts are such as the conflicts raging in Syria, Iraq, with all these type of parties, such as the so-called Islamic State, or some people prefer to call it Daesh for particular reasons, pro and anti-government militia. The situation in Nigeria, I had the pleasure to be in Nigeria in 2014 for a month. I was training the National Human Rights Commission on monitoring, investigation, reporting of serious violations. And one of the issues there was that, there are violations, big violations from Boko Haram, but there are also a lot of violations from the armed forces. And so somehow you get more than one party involved in serious violations, which amount to maybe not terrorism in a technical legal sense, but such abuse that it does much more harm than good. It's much more than enforcing law and order. It's stirring up much more resentment and hate. So, and that, of course, was under a previous regime, and I'm not commenting on any particular government policy at the moment in Nigeria. Also, we have Bukhari there, who's a different style than what we had under Goodluck Jonathan. Central African Republic, we're seeing all sorts of violations there that seem to have, a lawless character. And some of these other conflicts, northern Mali, we've seen some really horrific things, targeting of cultural property. And I just read a lengthy article that said, I was very pleased to see, that when the archives from centuries of the culture of the place, Arabic scripts that have a priceless value, 95% of them have been spirited away in the lead up to the assault on those religious texts. So those things are somehow safe. But the potential damage there and the kind of violations that have gone forward there, it makes the world quake. And also in DRC, this conflict has gone on for so long. And the other places I could mention there. I say maybe Pakistan, because you have Afghanistan, Darfur, South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen. There are certainly serious violations. But many people are saying, well, Pakistan's a little bit different because it's really criminal law enforcement. And it's very debatable whether that's an armed conflict or not, however, because in Khyber thank you very much, Pakhtunkhwa, and in Waziristan, you have pretty long duration of armed forces engaged, and also on the other side you have organized groups. The question is whether they're organized enough to say that this is an armed conflict. This is something one can discuss. But I'm not talking really about situations still considered below the Geneva Conventions threshold of armed conflict. And I mention these countries here, Honduras, Venezuela, and the others, even though they have really high homicide rates, murder rates. These are the top 9 countries that the UN Office of Drugs and Crime rated as the highest homicide countries. There's still issues that are being mainly addressed by the domestic criminal law with some support, transnational and mutual interstate cooperation. They're still mainly seen as criminal law problems, even though they're difficult, rather than armed conflict. And some of these have been armed conflicts. Some of them may become armed conflicts, but right now they're still seen below that Geneva Convention threshold. That's, everyone has their view, but this is my perspective on that so far, loosely speaking. So some of today's lawless conflicts, I think we know, project violence through terrorism. So if we just take the list, just take a random list from, say, 12 November to 25 January, the type of attacks we've seen outside these countries, which are big conflicts. So if you look at all these conflicts here, Afghanistan, we see that you're seeing, major violent attacks, terrorist attacks in other places you wouldn't necessarily expect. So that's why one of the reasons why Paris came as such a shock. Or you see San Bernardino, attacks in Quetta and Diyarbakir in Turkey, etc. And this is just a sample, as we all know. You can just open the newspapers and see every day or every couple of days there's a new attack or other. So it's the situation where, as we're going to see, most of terrorism attacks are carried out in armed conflict situations, and I'll show that in a moment. But they're also being projected in so many other countries that normally don't have this kind of terrorism these days. And so, I'm just mentioning that there are more attacks. There's so many others we could mention. Now, terrorism itself is not a new phenomenon. I think we all know that. But the point maybe I want to start off with is to say that today's terrorism seems qualitatively different from that of past decades. And this was part of the point I was raising in the Guardian article. In the 1970s and 80s, you had groups like Action Directe and Brigade Rose and Baader-Meinhof, Front de Libération de Québec, and all these other groups that basically targeted mainly the political independence of a single state. They were trying to, influence a particular state. And the way they operated was mainly within the territory of one state, even though there was, some transnational links and sometimes foreign support, but it was quite fairly limited. They could be countered mainly by domestic, civilian, and military law enforcement, which could target them basically as organized crime syndicates. So if you look back and you take a look at how these things were treated, how they were portrayed in the media, there was always an international aspect. But mainly it was police forces, sometimes with the help even of military services, military forces, but still mainly as seen as organized crime or as an organized criminal attack that was mainly to be dealt with from the domestic organs of the state. But now terrorism has become integral to certain armed conflicts. The Global Terrorism Index notes that 80% of terrorist attacks were perpetrated in armed conflict situations. So it means that the character of armed conflict is changing. I mean, there are some groups, the Vancouver-based group in Simon Fraser University, which shows that the number of deaths overall in armed conflict has gone down quite a lot, statistically. And in a way, they're saying war is becoming safer and safer, in a way. But on the other hand, if there are more terrorist actions and we're getting movement away from regular conventional warfare, the potential for scaling up through terrorism is there. And I'll make that point again in a moment. So you see, a rise in deaths from terrorism between the years 2000 and 2014. That's mainly related to armed conflict situations. Now, when I've been listening myself to some counter-terrorism lectures and presentations, or doing my own research, it's sometimes crossed my mind that we're actually talking about a very small number of victims, and the amount of, for example, money, and I didn't put that up there, but the amount of millions and millions, billions of dollars spent on counterterrorism and all the actions that governments take against terrorism makes you sometimes wonder, made me wonder, why, I'll come to you in a second, if we look at the number of victims, it's very small. And I'll just make this point and then I'll come to you.
Sure.
President Obama made the point last October that victims of gun violence far outnumber victims of terrorism in the United States. And there's a nice little graph that shows, over the same time period, almost, more than 400,000 deaths from gun violence, and less than 1% from terrorism. And that is, including the 9/11 attacks. So, it's a very small percentage. But the point is, and maybe that says more about gun violence in the U.S., and we're not living in the U.S. also, than about the gravity of terrorism globally. But the thing I want to argue next is terrorism still, if the numbers of victims is rather small, compared to traffic accidents or disease, malnutrition, or other big killers, it's still qualitatively different, and it's still important for reasons I will mention in a moment. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just for clarification, just on your previous slide, you were talking about the number of deaths from terrorist attacks in the course of armed violence. But how do you distinguish a terrorist attack in the course of armed violence or armed conflict from a regular attack? For instance, the Syrian government has been accused of committing terrorist attacks whilst using its own army. So how do you make the distinction here?
Well, one of the distinctions would be that, when we're talking about state forces, we are in a bit of a difficulty because they're prosecuting a war, and there's a default that they are preserving, they're internationally recognized in some way as preserving the sovereign integrity of the country. That is the default position, until they start doing things outside the laws of war. Now, the difference between terrorism and just ordinary violations of the Geneva Conventions or Ghraib breaches would be something I'm going to get to, but it's the intention and, as a campaign to try to intimidate the population and try to force a change in government policy or the policy of an authority. So, in a way, that runs contrary to the notion of a state prosecuting a war badly as terrorism, but it could happen, and you could have state-sponsored terrorism. We know that, so it's difficult to distinguish. On the other hand, when you have militia, trying to force government, it's easier to characterize it as that. So it's not a very clear answer that I can give you also in the abstract.
I look forward to your elaboration.
Sure, we can go on. But thanks for your question and for raising that. Let's go further. Terrorist attacks, and by the way, it also brings up definition, which is another issue I'll want to revisit. So thanks again. Terrorist attacks, why are they still important even though the numbers are small? That's where we were. Well, they deliberately maximize civilian casualties. It's not, we have many more thousands of traffic accidents, but traffic accidents are serious and they're tragic, but they're accidents. This is obviously, deliberate and it's got a different sense to it. And one of them is that it's trying to intimidate people and governments and instill fear, incite hate and further attacks. And not only that, even if the numbers are fairly small in the global picture, they have been rising. So we've seen an increase according to the Global Terrorism Index, and I don't necessarily agree with all their categories precisely, how they count terrorist victims and terrorist incidents. I mean, we can debate. Again, it's another thing to debate, what numbers. But I think most responsible researchers and observers have noticed that there is a substantial increase in the number of deaths from terrorism over the last several years. And it also fuels xenophobia, racism, intolerance, as well as restrictions on human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the reaction that we're getting from governments and also people's willingness to give up their human rights or to sacrifice some of them in some way. And there, I think that's an interesting graph from the Pew Research Center that shows, in Western countries and in Muslim countries, that the concern about Islamic extremism is going up quite a lot over the last couple of years. Moreover, just to take this a little bit further, today's terrorist organizations target economic and financial institutions, incurring substantial secondary economic and political costs, which go beyond the number of dead and injured. So I think this is an overestimate. I think 3.3 trillion is too high, because that also includes, the cost of the early wars of the early years of the Iraq conflict. So that's putting a big cost in there. But some people are saying, and this is from the New York Times article, it's 3.3 trillion is what the 9/11 cost is. I don't think it's that high, but in any case, it's hard to measure, and the costs are much more substantial in terms of economic, social, financial, and costs, and a difficult to measure, or possible to measure, chilling effect on people's lives and on political institutions. Some of today's terrorist organizations manage to evade detection through encrypted protocols, so that's another challenge. Oops, I meant to take that off, but it's still there. They also use trade-based money laundering. So they're quite sophisticated, maybe much more so than in the past. Quite clever ways to get around, money laundering controls. The kind of controls we have on banks, money coming in and out of bank accounts just doesn't seem to do it. There are so many other ways to move money and goods and to launder value that apparently it's not working so well. The tools that we are using. Islamic State, for example, has managed to secure steady and substantial oil revenue, and some estimates are maybe $2 million US dollars a day. And there you see quite a list of its assets. And these are some graphs that are from the annual financial report of ISIS itself. So they, it's not that they're hiring PricewaterhouseCoopers or Ernst & Young or there's other. They have pretty good accountants of their own, and they also like to use computers. And these are their own graphs. These were originally in Arabic. These ones have been changed into English, but this is a completely original one, and that gives a balance sheet. And just as you would go and have a brochure for your organization, the Islamic State also has a brochure that says, this is what you get for your money. This is what we were able to do last year, and next year we plan to go up 10%, and your money will be well spent. And so they list all the stuff, and some of the more gruesome things we see are YouTube videos of beheadings and other atrocities, etc. But some of them are just these kind of graphs that they try to document everything to attract more funds. But they're getting even greater revenue than from oil, from taxes, ransom money, extortion, levies on minorities. So quite a lot of funds coming in. And this is just a different ball game than we'd see in the 1970s and 80s, which were really some Mickey Mouse, no slur on Mickey Mouse, but terrorist organizations in terms of sustainability. It was a couple of people banding together, some of them much more strong than that, but still, I mean, if you look at IRA and ETA, they're sustainable organizations financially and organizationally much more than some of the others. But so I wouldn't underestimate that either. But still, this seems to be a different level than we're used to, and there's a reason for it as well. We'll get to that. So, as if that were not enough, Islamic State has been trying to acquire material for a dirty bomb, and you might think, well, that how is that really possible. It might not be. It's just too difficult to do that. It's got to be technically difficult, but it doesn't take a lot to make one. There are some 70,000 devices with nuclear material in about 13,000 buildings around the world, which have very low security or no security at all. So that's not that difficult to get. So that's a worry. Did you see that they just a couple of days ago they picked up in the somebody related to the Paris attacks film of that they had taken of a nuclear official in one of in Belgium at a very weakly guarded, poorly guarded facility. So they're going to target that person. One way is obviously to try to grab their family, hold them ransom, and try to get some material, or at least access. So this is a worry. The U.S. National Security's senior director for weapons of mass destruction said 3 years ago she was surprised nuclear terrorism hadn't happened yet, because it would be so easy to do it. Because it's not making a nuclear bomb, with fissionable material and the centrifuges and all that. It's just exploding stuff, nuclear material, above the city and dirtying up the place. As Islamic State has probably been trying to figure out, I should say very probably, it's quite clear, how to deploy chemical weapons. So just a few days ago, you're getting, the United States has been interrogating people, one expert in Iraq on chemical weapons, for example. So all of this, the point of all this is to say that, well, we have fairly small numbers of victims so far, but there's a high potential for a ramping up of terrorist incidents, increased numbers of casualties, and sustained threat. So the potential is very strong. Islamic State also controls, and this is what's different than most terrorist organizations we've seen, is a very large territorial expanse. That is another game changer. So, and it's levying taxes, as I've mentioned, trying to establish a viable caliphate that ignores national frontiers. You saw them demolishing, perhaps some pictures in the newspaper, demolishing some of the guard posts between Iraq and Syria the other day. And that's another thing from from their state building manual that has been acquired by intelligence forces. They have a state building manual that shows how to, capacity develop, the organs of the state. I think if they applied for funding from UNDP, they would not get it. But it sounds like a lot of the work that we do in human rights. We try to support the judiciary. We try to support the Human Rights Commission. I'd like to see an Islamic State Human Rights Commission or something. I mean, it's very funny. I mean, they're in a scariest type of way. But we're going to build a state, and we're going to take the garbage out. They're fixing roads. They're running the hospitals. They're running schools in a really nasty, harsh way. But they're filling a gap there. And maybe the state did not do so well before, especially during time of armed conflict. Of course, it breaks down. All the while, strictly enforcing an extreme interpretation of Sharia law. And that is thrilling a lot of people. And they're offering people who, maybe be feeling they're not sure who they are and where their loyalties lie and what their place in society is. Offers them identity, even spiritual fulfillment, excitement and adventure. Come and learn how to shoot an AK-47 at some poor person, right? With his hands tied behind his back. All the while inciting, hatred, religious intolerance, and violence. Okay, so we're seeing a huge number of fresh recruits. That again, in the 70s and 80s, you had these secret communications between people here and there, and you got bands and cells. If you look at left-wing terrorism in Italy, for example, that went on for a long time. But you didn't get huge numbers of recruits coming, by the thousands. It was not like that. Or in some of the other, if you look at Front de Libération of Quebec, for example, there's very small numbers. Here we're getting thousands and thousands of people. So today's lawless conflicts in so many countries involve genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and all these kind of violations. These are, kidnapped victims who are executed. Kenji Goto and his Jordanian pilot. All these serious violations. Recall Boko Haram Chibok, the Chibok girls, schoolgirls, and the whole raft of violations across the board, from human rights, humanitarian law, international criminal law. On the other side, even states which normally respect the Geneva Conventions have increasingly resorted to means and methods of warfare that international humanitarian law doesn't really recognize. I shouldn't say doesn't really, just does not recognize. And there you have, some manuals from the Army War College of the United States that have to do with, for example, covert operations. And when you have covert operations, the rules of engagement are rather less transparent and rather less in line with international humanitarian law than you would like if you're inclined to support the rule of law internationally. Hybrid warfare strategies and non-uniformed personnel being used. Now, the whole purpose of having uniformed personnel is that you're identifiable and you're accountable under international humanitarian law. And so if you send people without their badges, obviously there's a problem there. Proxy forces and agents, private security companies, and mercenaries. Mercenaries have been around a long time. That's not so new, but they are still being used. And they tend to consider themselves beyond the reach of law and military discipline. New technology such as drones further complicates matters in terms of distinction between civilians and combatants, and sometimes seems to approximate summary executions. It's, prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner all in one, with targeting somebody, and then, well, we've found a militant. How can you be sure? And often there's issues of so-called collateral damage, etc. as well. But this also further complicates the prosecution of the war by governments. The U.S. bombed a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz. That was a really nasty one. A lot of people died. I commented on it in the news about this because it's worrying if there are big, serious violations that reduce the legitimacy of the warring parties in the field. When we need the law to be respected by all sides, and at least to have those kind of constraints. That was a really bad bombing, and I don't say there was intention to bomb that hospital, but obviously something went wrong with the command and control in that case, which is a serious issue. You can also recall Abu Ghraib, and the instructive case of Royal Marine Sergeant Alexander Blackman I want to raise, who in September 2011 in Afghanistan captured a seriously wounded Taliban operative. He took away his high explosive grenade and AK-47, prevented anyone else from administering first aid, and then shot him dead at close range and said, "It's nothing you wouldn't do to us." Some kind of reciprocity in his mind. Obviously, this doesn't go anywhere, fellas. I just broke the Geneva Convention. And this image here is, he didn't realize that, his fellow trooper had the helmet cam on, and that film was later on found by military police, and he was brought to trial. He was court-martialed, sentenced to life for the murder, and on appeal that was reduced to 10 years. The interesting thing was that many questioned after that point, well, what's really the point of having the Geneva Conventions for one side? The other side is a bunch of terrorists. And you had armed forces personnel, active service personnel, expressing their anger about this. And until the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom put a ban and said, you cannot show up. You're non-political. You're not allowed to rally in front of the MOD or anywhere else in front of the court to say that this person should not be held responsible under the Geneva Conventions. And many people defied that in any case. So in The Guardian, I asked whether the Geneva Conventions, mainly to limit cruelty in wars fought by regular soldiers, possibly could apply to today's terrorist groups who don't wear uniforms, don't necessarily follow a regular military command structure, and don't have any intention to apply international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions, so, these are the requirements. Is it not impractical, even dangerously naive, to treat captured insurgents humanely when they wouldn't hesitate to execute you if you were captured and terrorize you in your own countries? And a lot of people are saying that. Well, why should the coalition forces here, there, everywhere follow international humanitarian law if the other side is not doing that? And this gentleman is John Yu, who was the legal counsel, who drafted the famous "Torture is okay," no Geneva Conventions for a side that breaks the Geneva Conventions, professor of law. And he has a very nice smile there, but what he was saying wasn't necessarily a happy thing. So why not use enhanced interrogation techniques? It's another possibility. In exceptional circumstances, if it could yield critical information that saves the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers and civilians. It's been the argument of a lot of people in the United States, for example. And we have this guy here, Dick Cheney's. I was a big supporter of waterboarding. I was a big supporter of the enhanced interrogation techniques. And if you've seen any of his more recent interviews, he's reiterating that position very strongly. And in the US, there is a strong tendency to say, torture may be okay. It used to be in the old days, torture was taboo. Now they're saying, well, look at the situation we have. Maybe it's one means that we can use. And, on the campaign stump, that's a quote. I would bring back waterboarding, and I would bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding with this style of speaking, shall we say. All right. So, and just today you saw that, I thought this was interesting, the Economist Intelligence Unit just today came out with saying that the biggest risks to world security, are these things, and Donald Trump and the rising threat of jihadi terrorism are equal. So Donald Trump wins the U.S. presidential election, and the rising threat of jihadi terrorism are the same. They're at the same level of threat to the world, says the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is an index I enjoy and I respect quite a lot. But I thought that was quite interesting. It just came out some hours ago, and it's reported in the newspapers. So, but why stick with the Geneva Conventions? Is it really worth it? Well, the court-martial appeals court in the Sergeant Alexander Blackman case held that he jeopardized other British service members' lives by going to extremes. Because the word was going to get out, and then it was, it's going to be a free-for-all. Jihadists will use his actions to radicalize others, encourage terrorist groups to fight UK forces, and exact more brutal retribution or reprisal. I'm not sure whether I find that all that convincing, because I think they are bad enough already. They're already torturing, raping, beheading people anyway. So are they going to say, oh, now we're really going to do it? I'm not sure. But I would buy the arguments in maybe other conflicts. I'm not sure it's so compelling. Maybe I have some other reasons. I would add, and I said this in the Guardian article, the Geneva Conventions set minimum standards. These are minimum standards, not maximum standards, of humane treatment, without which cruelty in wartime would be completely unlimited. So just throwing them out opens up something which is the gateway to a worse hell. Ignoring, tolerating, or excusing war crimes from your own side corrodes everybody's respect for the principles of military necessity, proportionality, and humanity, and weakens respect for the international rule of law in general, which in turn increases the likelihood of further conflict. You're taking an important ingredient of peace and security out of the equation and saying, well, law doesn't really work so effectively, so let's just throw it out. When you do that, you are removing an important brake on atrocities. Even from a strategic point of view, winning battles through murder, torture, summary executions, and other crimes is a sure way to lose the war for hearts and minds, simply because it's bringing everyone down to the same level of the terrorist. And it's even from a point of view of military strategy, it runs contrary to counterinsurgency strategies, that you have to win people's trust and make them like you and trust you and rely on you. Use of force is a small part of military strategy. It's legitimacy and morale that are more important. So, that makes a big difference in longer-term conflicts. So, can international law address today's lawless conflicts? Well, the Geneva Conventions extend POW, prisoner of war status, to lawful combatants, members of the armed forces, etc. Under responsible command, as I've said, we all know this, I think, with fixed distinctive signs. They have to carry arms openly, conduct operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. That kind of rules out POW status for captured terrorists operating in lawless conflicts, at least according to the Geneva Conventions the way they are now. But that doesn't mean that Geneva Conventions don't apply at all in so-called lawless conflicts. As we saw from Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, Common Article 3 is a standard you can't go below. And that, the United States said, well, okay, we're going to abide by it in any case, even, Article 75, Protocol 1, even though the United States is not a state party. The point is, the Geneva Conventions are not particularly well suited to this kind of asymmetric conflict situation where one party deliberately violates rather than abides by international humanitarian law. Because one of the premises of international humanitarian law, and the Geneva Conventions in particular, is that there has to be a willingness, an effort to apply the conventions. Otherwise, you're really in a very difficult situation. Instead of saying our intention is to violate the conventions, what do you do with that? That's more difficult. States have been cooperating to fight terrorism for a long time. We have all these conventions on terrorism in maybe 13 main areas. We have about 19 or 20 conventions. We have the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Committee and all the cooperation through the Security Council. There's no, however, UN Convention Against Terrorism, nor an internationally agreed upon general legal definition of terrorist act. And I have only a few more slides, so bear with me. That prohibits specific ways in which terrorism may be committed. So, prohibiting specific ways in which terrorism is committed. If we go back for a moment, we see Convention on Offenses Against, aircraft, civil aviation, taking of hostages, nuclear material, bombings, financing of terrorism. All this approach that the international community has been taking over many years is like saying, well, it's like having different crimes. Murder with a gun, murder with a knife, murder with a stick, instead of prohibiting murder per se. Those are all aspects of terrorism. All these transnational counter-terrorism conventions that we have are pretty much specific ways to commit terrorism that are prohibited. So a comprehensive legal definition of the crime of terrorism could promote coherence, interstate cooperation, and effectiveness. The problem is states still disagree very much over what terrorism is, not so much over what it is, but what should be considered lawful exceptions to it, such as freedom fighters from colonial domination. Well, I think that's fairly well established. We have Protocol 2 on supplementing Common Article 3 to the 4 Geneva Conventions on non-international armed conflict, which legitimizes the use of force for national liberation movements. It doesn't legitimize terrorism by them, by the way. So it's not one person's. I never agreed with this phrase. One person's
freedom fighter, yeah,
is another person's terrorist. You may be a freedom fighter and may be legitimate, but you still can't violate the Geneva Convention. So that for me was always a phrase that's been mistaken. Right to use force against serious human rights abuse. I mean, if the government is really, if they're committing a genocide, can you use force? And maybe even that some of it constitutes terrorism to get the government to change its policy, and then maybe has a transnational character. Would that then become terrorism? What about the right to use force against a corrupt and tyrannical regime? We have seen some interesting situations where people seem to get fed up with a particular regime and the excesses and thrown it off, perhaps encouraged by some governments or some forces outside the country. That's another debate, depending on which country we're talking about. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon ruled that international customary law defines terrorism to consist of commission of a criminal act, specific intent to spread fear or coerce an authority, and a transnational element. It's a very simple and I think fairly accurate definition, which you could get from all the resolutions and conventions and other sources. That comes from the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. But the tribunal's assertion that a customary rule of international law recognizes a clearly defined crime of terrorism doesn't succeed in glossing over the lack of clear and unambiguous agreement among states, I would argue, on the legal definition of terrorism, the permissible exceptions, and what are the state obligations and legal consequences for failure to prevent terrorist offenses and to extradite, prosecute, and punish offenders. And that's very important because we should know clearly, what happens to a state if it doesn't take the actions it's supposed to. Under the CTC, we have some rules. There could be sanctions, et cetera, and those would be binding on all UN member states under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But we don't have that from any other source. Similarly, the ICC statute does not explicitly refer to terrorist offenses. Well, of course, everybody will say that some of the crimes do, and I'll get to that in a moment. I was at the Rome conference actually, and there were moves to include terrorism, drug trafficking, certain other transnational crimes, but they were not included because it was felt that those treaty-based crimes were, let's say, not so well established in general international law that they would garner the same level of support and have the same international status of law that we see in genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So, plus it was also argued that drug trafficking and terrorism may be very minor, and the court is supposed to really look at crimes of international concern, which somehow is much more for the core crimes than for these things. So, However, they're maybe covered indirectly from the Rome Statute, because a lot of the crimes that are committed under these categories of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, also cover things that are typically done in terrorist attacks. The Netherlands again proposed, they did it first at the Rome Conference, but they again proposed including terrorism at the next opportunity at the Kampala ICC Review Conference in 2010. But the disagreement continues over definition. Perhaps the answer might be to establish a permanent hybrid court mixing international law and available domestic law. So that's maybe a possibility. To conclude, international law could meet the challenges of lawless conflicts, but only if the international community strengthens international norms and implementation, rather than cast law to the winds. Updates the Geneva Conventions. There's always a risk in that. We know, eh? We don't want to have countries jump all over it and say, oh yeah, we'll update them and then weaken them, right? That's a risk. But perhaps maybe an additional protocol on asymmetric conflict to reinforce minimum standards of protection. That's not going to prevent terrorist outrages, but it may prevent the slide into illegal and opaque overreaction that's outside of the normal constraints and the accepted limits of international humanitarian law. Because that is a concern in terms of legitimacy and the long-term struggle. Improves mutual interstate cooperation to fight terrorism at regional and global levels. It's a very squeaky, often not very well functioning system that we have. I think it's being strengthened these days in the European context, but with many countries it simply doesn't function. It's too cumbersome to get information, to get intelligence, to share up-to-date information that could be turned into evidence, etc. But in order to have trust, to make mutual state cooperation work better, it means that every country has to up its game in terms of democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law. For example, nobody wants to extradite a terrorist suspect to a country where there is a lack of fair trial, where the judiciary is not independent, or where there is the death penalty. Many countries, rightfully in my opinion, have qualms about the death penalty, and so that's another issue there. Defines the international crime of terrorist offense in a comprehensive convention. It's a possibility. Perhaps update the Rome Statute. I think there's limited prospect for that. It may not be very realistic to cover terrorism, but maybe, like I say, set up a permanent hybrid terrorism court. The international community has to respect the fact that international human rights law applies in time of armed conflict, and certain human rights cannot be derogated from any time. More broadly, intensify diplomatic, political, and strategic cooperation through the UN and regional collective security arrangements. I'd leave it at that and open up discussion and hope that you found some of the ideas maybe interesting in the presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think it addressed many perspectives, problems, issues, legal fields as well. So I'm sure there will be many questions. My colleague Wim has a mic. To whom can I give the floor? Yes, Wim.
Hi, my name is Iva Vukušić. I'm from the Utrecht University. I have two questions, I guess, or one question and one comment. The question relates to the people that are arguing for not applying the Geneva Conventions. What specifically do they have in mind? How this non-application would work? I'm just curious because I'm not sure. Is this serious? Is there a serious movement for this? And secondly, this relates to the use of torture. This is not my field, but I've read that even if you don't have a moral problem with it, it doesn't work. Like I've read studies that say we could do it, but like the results are not, it's not, it may be attractive, but it doesn't work. So just kind of these two things. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe I'll respond right away. Yeah, sure.
Actually, yours.
I think it works still.
Yeah.
now we're going to have double trouble. I think your comment actually addresses your question. So you may have answered it yourself, and in that, I agree with you. The evidence, and you can see this from the U.S. congressional hearings, it's very much in depth about waterboarding and other forms of torture. That it's very unlikely that any actionable intelligence was gained.
Right.
And they're only able to show possibly 2 or 3 pieces of information. And the damage to your moral standing as a country is enormous. So the norms against torture, have been under threat for years, and it's not just the United States. I would say that the George Bush administration had it completely wrong, and me and many other people have always disagreed with that very strongly and vocally, and many good American lawyers in the country have raised it, and that's why we have Hamdan, Rumsfeld, and other cases. So to their credit, but the administration got it completely wrong because it's just a very short-sighted thing. Aside from the practical aspects, it completely undercuts the enormous soft power that country has. To say that we are above that, we are fighting the fair fight, and it will come down to legitimacy in any longer-term war, and that's just a way to throw it in the garbage. And terrorists love it. They say, "Wow, look, see, we told you you're unmasking who you really are." And I say it's not only the United States, because despite all the pronouncements, and there's only maybe a single country that for a while said that torture was okay, and even that got overturned by the Supreme Court, and I don't want to particularly mention it, which country it was. But every other country has said that they respect the rules against torture. But we know that the practice of torture, statistically, has gone up quite a lot. And I think it was maybe Amnesty International or some other organizations that have documented the trade in implements of torture. And that shows a lot. Somebody's buying that stuff. And it's governments that are buying it, and the trade is going up a lot. So yes, is it a serious argument? Well, you had the Bush administration pushing this argument and getting the legal opinion to say it was okay, and following it in saying waterboarding is not really torture, and even maybe torture's okay in some way, and you're getting the Donald Trump right now arguing for it. So yeah, you have people in serious positions. But what worries me more, or just as much, let me put it that way, is people that are not arguing about it, but they're doing it, they're carrying it out in many countries of the world. So it's a big struggle, and that would be my answer. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Ziad Massoud. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Paris-Est. I have a question concerning the Paris attack. It's a terrorist attack happening in peaceful times, so Paris was not under armed conflict. And then we have the President Hollande saying that France is in war, and that the term war or la guerre is as if it is an armed conflict which has begun all of a sudden in France, in Paris. Is it sufficient to characterize an armed conflict with only one attack, and then all of a sudden an armed conflict is raising, and then we apply the Geneva Conventions and the international humanitarian law, and what is the end of this armed conflict? This is the thing, and I think that we have to stick to the definition of armed conflict given by the ICJ or ICTY, that there is a threshold of intensity and all those conditions of the Geneva Conventions. Otherwise, the whole world will be in an armed conflict, endless armed conflict, forever.
It's an excellent comment, and it's one I very much agree with. And I've always had deep misgivings about the terminology, not just of François Hollande, but of the global war on terror. Because in one way, it ignores the objective criteria that have been set very responsibly by states themselves through the good auspices of the diplomatic conferences of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to say these are the criteria, which some of them you just mentioned, which are spelled out in the Geneva Conventions and the protocols. Those are the criteria that we have to respect. And so you're correct. And I heard some colleagues saying when the President Hollande said, this is a war. That happened. They said, "Oh my gosh, they should never say that." And I was thinking at the time, yes, they're right. And it also maybe dignifies the other side to say, there's another warring party. That's also a risk, rather than just saying what it is. It's terrorism, even though it's the most serious attack France had suffered since the end of World War II. But I don't want to pick on President Hollande, because for the simple reason that from what I read and saw in the news, it looked like a war, and it looked like something horrific, really bad, and we were talking about big numbers. So I wouldn't pick on President Hollande so much. I know that a president should be more careful with his language, and as a internationalist and law, I would say, listen, it's not a good thing to say, and it's not even correct. But I can understand somebody saying that. And instead of saying, "Oh no, you can't say it." Okay, I think one of the reasons he may have said it was to also give notice that he intends to follow up politically, but militarily, in Syria with armed force. Now, that's maybe not the correct way to go about characterizing and say this is a war now, but certainly the conflict in Syria, we can get into this argument as well, to me, it looks like an internationalized armed conflict, if not an international armed conflict. And so, in a way, France is directly involved. They're using their bombers, but that's in Syria, not in France. So, I agree with your point, but I just maybe add those other comments there. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Sunga, my name is Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry from International Human Rights Commission. Following Dr. Christopher, I also want to say that my compliments on your highly qualitative, quantitative presentation. And I could feel some sort of human touch as well into that. So it was not a presentation by a political or a scientist, someone, but you had something. I appreciate that. I have a very innocent sort of question.
No question is innocent, but go ahead.
A US drone attack in Yemen kills a family of 4 or 5. There is one survival. So the person who survives, very next day, he kills a US soldier. So US drone attack, which doesn't have any legitimacy because it is not allowed by the government of Yemen, but US is just using their power. So according to the Geneva Convention and the international criminal law, what will be the situation of this person who kills a soldier in response of killing his family? Because US certainly will declare him as a terrorist or something. But if he kills a US soldier responding that situation, so if you can tell us, please.
It's a great case to discuss in a classroom at length, because it raises many many different issues, which are not hypothetical. They're very real issues, and they do happen. And it is such that it's raising a number of issues all at once, which I don't think we could possibly solve all at once. But let me just maybe highlight a few of them, which I think are raised very well in your question. One of them is that it's not very clear the legality of drone attacks, and that's why I registered my disquiet with drone attacks, because it is fighting at a distance. There's a question as to whether the appreciation of the distinction between civilians and combatants can be responsibly made. But even if we get around that and say, well, we've identified very well that these people are carrying out these attacks, then you're caught in a bit of a dilemma, because on the one hand, if it's a criminal law issue, then there are rules in international law governing the use of firearms for criminal law enforcement, which are very strict, and we have those guidelines, and it's not intended, unless there's an imminent threat or self-defense. That's the very basic rule. You're not allowed to be shooting people. So self-defense or imminent threat against another person or target, you can use proportional, even then, proportional and strictly limited force. So that would be the criminal law, but it's beyond the criminal law situation. It's an armed conflict, but here we're talking. This is not regulated clearly by international humanitarian law, because we have. I'm not saying there's a legal vacuum. I wouldn't say that, because for me there is no legal vacuum. Human rights applies, humanitarian law applies, and norms of international criminal law. So I wouldn't like to say that there are legal black holes, which was very convenient for some states to say that. But the use of drones and the way they're being used but there's no effort, there's no possibility to disarm a person, to give them a trial, which is what the Geneva Conventions would require. It's really a summary execution policy. If we're talking about combatants, and that they're combatants, and then you're in less of a problem, because in war you don't just have a right, but you have a duty to kill. Killing is different. It's not murder when a soldier is shooting at another soldier, or even a rebel force, if it's lawful. So it raises all this quagmire that is very uncomfortable to give a straight answer, a clearer answer than I can give at that. But I could say that it's also maybe understandable. Somebody impassioned and enraged would do something like take revenge. But this is one of the problems that comes down to why we need rule following and to have these issues cleared up, because the rules have to be clear, because prosecution of war itself has to also be legitimate in its means and methods. And this gets us into a quagmire that I couldn't say more about than that. Hope that maybe gives you a response. You're welcome.
David Berg, one of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. I congratulate you on your address and the elegant way you dealt with our judgment in relation to a definition of terrorism. I can't, as a member of the court that decided that, argue it was either a good decision or it wasn't. But the topic is one of very great importance. It's been 78 years since the first international attempt to find a convention referring to Article 38, which I have open, of the statute of the International Court of Justice, which is the first of the four means of finding law that talks about. Well, 78 years is rather a long time. The need for a common definition couldn't be clearer. And ISIS are operating across borders in every direction. For the international community not to have a single rope to pull on is absurd and hugely dangerous. And the Security Council is constantly talking about terrorism. Its resolutions are full of it. And when you actually do as you helpfully did, indicated, and sketch lines across a point or points, where do the 250 definitions of terrorism coalesce? And in the middle, there's a great black bullseye that all the lines
They do.
cover, which is, I don't doubt, something that was in the mind of the Lebanon Tribunal. I don't speak for it at the moment. The other bits of Article 38 are, of course, international custom as evidence of a general practice. Well, when you look at where the lines go, that's a pretty good evidence of custom. And then you have the general principles of law, about which the same thing can be said. And then finally we come to you and your colleagues, the jurists, the most highly qualified publicists. We had a crack at
Well,
that.
thanks for saying that, but I wouldn't necessarily.
But we had our crack at it, right or wrong. There's been those who disagree emphatically and those who support it. But those who disagree never come up with a positive answer. In England, I'm nearly finished, there was the big issue about whether or not helping someone to take their own life was a breach of Section 2 of the Suicide Act. The law lords got very angry with the government and the parliament and said, it's taken you 12 years. You haven't come up with whether or not this is lawful, what the limits are. And the judges actually have a job to step in. And we give you notice that if you don't, we will. Well, of course, Parliament did and disagreed with what the judges had intended to do. So it's just as well the judges didn't step in. But since Calvin's case in 1605, it's been the judge's job to protect the citizen and ultimately to step in. And what I would like to see is some academics step up, face this one, and without asking for a perfect version, which you can get from international treaty, say, well, there is a minimal bullseye, a zone in which all the material criteria meet. Let's call that terrorism for purposes of international criminal law. What's your reaction to such a proposal?
Yeah, I don't have any disagreement with you at all, and I thank you for your kind comments and saying that that it's helpful to have that kind of debate and the question. I don't think there's been any lack of Article 38(1)D sources about on terrorism in the sense that there's been so much written about it. So I think there's been no lack there, and I think they have looked. If you look at all the dozens of articles on the definition of terrorism, they do come to a fairly the common denominator comes down to what was probably Antonio Cassese's inspiration, the late Antonio Cassese. That these three elements are what you find in all these definitions. Not just from scholarly opinion, but also from conventions and state practice. And I think that was very useful that he did that, because that's a judicial pronouncement which has much more status than the other sources of law. And now, general principles of international law, we could glean that from the state practice of the courts, but that was not the original. That was not the original concept of what does mean general principles of law. When Ricci Bussati was proposing it in the statute of the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1922, what he was arguing, the Italian jurist, what he was arguing was that general principles of law should be a filler, where we don't have enough conventions and clear customary rules of international law that can be gleaned from the logic of the law itself to avoid a non-liquet. That is, there's not enough law. And that we could decide the decision. Now, for me, norms of terrorism, which is a substantive issue, doesn't necessarily intuitively fall into general principles, except we could say maybe, well, it comes from ordre public in some way, perhaps. I mean, we could make that argument. So, but for me, I'm still a little bit hesitant that if could the Special Tribunal for Lebanon do by its lex specialis, could it in this pronouncement do what states have been unable to do, and that is to say, okay, now we all agree on a clear legal definition and agree to be bound by it. I think we need a convention, and I very much agree with that. Point that you're making, I think, as well, is that it would be good to have states step up to the task and say, listen, defining it is not that much of a difficulty. The exceptions, it's a little bit more problematic, but let's get the job done. It's been in the legal committee of the United Nations for decades, and it's not been going anywhere. Partly because states they want to reserve. For me, this is the biggest problem. They want to reserve the right, as a matter of territorial sovereignty, political independence, and their own policies, to be able to support movements they think, armed force movements, and the right to use violence against governments they don't like. And it comes down. That is a brick wall in this so far.
Well, we use the Nicaragua principle as a means of sanding off idiosyncratic objections, and at all events, that's not further question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's something very much I agree with, and your whole perspective on it is something I agree with. I share the same concern. So thank you for that. Any other questions at this stage?
Maybe Chris.
Thank you. Shachar Beria from the Embassy of Israel, from the International Law Department. Personally, regarding the definition of terrorism, those are very important points. Throughout the last 2 weeks, I saw the Marshall Islands debate in the International Court of Justice what the meaning of the word dispute means, just the plain word of dispute. So I don't think that if we even get to a definition of terrorism, we still stop all debating of who is a terrorist and what is a terrorist organization. I just think it will change the problem to another direction. The Honorable Gentleman mentioned the House of Lords. I will mention the Supreme Court of the United States, that referring to pornography, stated that one of the justices said that I know it when I see it. So it may be another type of strategy to maybe have a list, like many organizations have, of what we identify as a terrorist activity, as a terrorist organization, and that is maybe practical enough to, if all parties relevant agree, to as a solution to the definition problem. Just my opinion. My question regards the latest approach by the UN, which Israel is endorsing also, regarding the combating violent extremism, in the sense that we see the problem as the ideology driving those acts that lead to various complexities and to those crimes, and to addressing the root of the problem in the ideological sense or in the education level. What is your opinion on this approach? What are the advantages or disadvantages that you identify? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Your point on countering violent extremism is very well taken. In particular, the approach. I mean, if we're really talking about terrorism in its larger perspective, root causes has to be very much part of the picture. Addressing root causes. So and countering violent extremism is looking at education and try to understand people's motives and the human security aspects that drive terrorism and marginalization, etc. So there's a whole wider debate there that of course I would agree with. So on the question as to whether maybe we really need a definition or not, I'm partial to your to the view that it's not always necessary. I mean, we have, for example, the right of peoples to self-determination. It's a very important right, and it's in Article 1 of both of the covenants, international covenants, and it's in the UN Charter. But we don't really have a definition of a people. We have minority rights, but we don't have a very clear definition, except at the regional level here or there, on what is a minority. And we have certain reports from the UN and certain indicators of criteria. So one can get away without definitions. But on the other hand, if we are moving towards greater coordination, international cooperation, and prosecution of terrorists, for those things you do need as clear legal norms as possible to make the expectations clear. What are the state obligations? And people that get involved with terrorism, it may be some comfort to them. They say, well, nobody knows really what it is. It depends on, we know it when we see it, but we don't agree. We have our own view, and we don't see it that way. If you have a clearer definition, even if it's a broad one, maybe that's better than leaving it open, because that means that you are still always at square one in terms of moving beyond it. And I agree with your other comment, is that defining it doesn't solve it, but it may be one important step towards taking other legal measures, because then you have a definition more of what you're talking about, even if it's not very precise. So I see your point, and I'm leaning towards that we do need a definition that is more comprehensive than these specific kind of definitions. But I also see, your side of the argument too. So yeah, thank you very much. Do you have time for any other?
Is there somebody else? Otherwise, you will get the last one. Then you will get the last one.
Thank you. My name is Tamara Quiroga. I'm from Buenos Aires University. Very interesting your presentation. I would like a short question because I know we do not have much time. I would like more information about your idea about the permanent hybrid terrorism court. Will it be set up by international treaty, or maybe by the UN Security Council? What is your idea? I would like to know more about that, because every country agrees about the importance of terrorism. Every country condemns it. I think we are all agree about the need of a definition. I know that's very difficult, but I think it's very important about the conviction of a terrorism. And I was not aware about that idea, about the permanent hybrid terrorism court. I think it's very difficult to set up one. The other choice that you brought up was to update the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I think that is tougher, that set up a permanent hybrid terrorism court. I would like to know more about that idea.
Sure, thanks very much. First of all, I want to in all academic honesty, say that that's not my idea.
I know.
Yeah, exactly. And I only from somebody named Aaron Cregan, and who's working at the U.S. Department of Justice. So all credit for the idea goes to her completely. But at least I saw it, and why I found it attractive, this argument. Maybe that's what I could comment on. It's because the special courts have been remarkably much easier to make them function well. We've seen, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon is a bit where has been more problematic because it's objectively very difficult, the circumstances. I was actually at Rafiq Hariri's when he was lying in state, and I took a beautiful picture there. And I was there before the bombing and afterwards. I'm not implicating myself. I was terribly shaken by what happened there on the 14th of February of that year, it's very difficult circumstances. But if you look at the special and tribunals and hybrid courts, where they've been mixing domestic law with international law, one can make a case that they have worked rather well. The special, Charles Taylor was going over the ICC, but the Sierra Leone and the special tribunal, and I wouldn't argue the extraordinary, Cambodia, extraordinary courts and chambers in the courts of Cambodia. It's a long title. And I was there. I was there at the first trial of Dutch was there. I happened to show up there. It was remarkable to see this mathematics techer who was running S21, who was also there the same day, and saw this torture chamber. So that was a whole school, which he ran meticulously, counting all the numbers and making it run well. But that's not a good example. It's not worked very well. But I think the Special Tribunal for Lebanon shows a lot of potential for working well if we can get a hold of more people and get a hold of this particular suspects, and the Sierra Leone court. It's been easier to get those things moving. The ICTY and ICTR, they've done remarkable work, but it's been difficult. And the ICC has had an uphill battle because institution building is very difficult. So I think that maybe a specialized court would avoid the problem where you say some countries are already trying to think that maybe we shouldn't be part of this. And this will give them a perfect excuse. In the case of the ICC, you're seeing some backlash in some African countries to say, listen, this is enough for us, and that's the camel that breaks the, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So maybe updating the Rome Statute would be problematic, but those countries that are more like-minded may spearhead a permanent court that, as I say, could mix domestic law of a case where let's say according to territory or nationality of the person or victims, and fill it in with international law. So I think it's an interesting idea. I haven't looked into it. Sure, why not? I mean, instead of ad hoc. And have it as a standing court. Permanent courts are always better because every time you have to marshal the political will to set up a new ad hoc court, it's a very cumbersome process. And that's one of the reasons why we've moved from the ICTY and ICTR. And I was involved with in the early days of the establishment of the ICTR back in '94. I was very proud of being involved there. But we were very conscious of the fact that we were able to get the ICTR established. I think 13 votes to 2 abstentions of Rwanda and one other country, maybe China. No, China was I don't remember now. But there's been no international criminal court for DRC, which has had many more deaths. Maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 million, depending if you take the Ituri 1 and Ituri 2 conflicts and all the deaths because the political will's not there. So if you're setting it up through the Security Council, you have trouble. And if whatever mechanism, whether it's through the General Assembly, there has to be a mechanism for ad hoc tribunals, then you're getting back into political will and it's retrospective. And you have to wait till there's so many deaths to get the political will going that what's the point? But if you have a permanent court, standing court, that maybe assures countries that we're going to use your law, but just where it's that we're going to make sure that it is in conformity with the international standards. That may be reassuring to countries that want to have this objective and independent forum that may help them decide these kind of cases. So that's an idea, and that's just some thinking on it. But as I say, one would have to look into Aaron Cregan's article for much more extensive argumentation, which I think you might find interesting as I did. So thanks very much.
Perhaps for a new lecture. Thanks for that suggestion. In view of the time, I think unfortunately we have to conclude, but maybe you can ask the question later as well. I would like to thank everyone for coming to the Austrian Institute, of course, in particular Dr. Sunga. So thank you very much. We have some new lectures coming up at Asse. For example, on the 12th of April, Alexis Demirjan from the ICC and Norman Guibert from the ICTY, they will provide a lecture entitled The Legal Ramifications of the Armenian genocide, compensation, genocidal intent, and failure to prosecute. And end of May, we'll also organize a book launch on foreign fighters under international law. But there are more events in the pipeline, so please check the ASA website or better sign up for our newsletter. And finally, please know that increasingly our lectures are being recorded and that they will be posted online on our International Crimes Database at internationalcrimesdatabase.org. So please have a look there as well. Thanks again for coming and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thanks.